Hi everyone, welcome to our video on how to be a good speech judge. This is brought to you by the SDA Speech and Debate team, and let's just jump straight into it. So first off, let's start with dramatic and humorous interpretation. What is this? Well, this is an event where speakers cut or edit a piece of media, that can be a book, movie, play, short story, or etc., into an 8 to 10 minute speech. The difference between dramatic and humorous interpretation, dramatic is generally sad, or they're sparking real world insight. Generally, they are impactful and they're sharing larger messages, whereas humorous interpretations are funny. There's no stand-up in humorous interpretation, so it's generally just going to be a funnier piece. The students did not write their speeches, aside from their intros, which is just a little paragraph that they wrote to introduce the piece to you. They're just pre-existing works. And so in judging dramatic and humorous interpretation, you do want to time their speeches, make sure it's 8 to 10 minutes. They do have a 30-second grace period, but if they are over that period, so if it's below 7:30 or above 10:30, that is when you start reducing their points. 25% of their speech, 25% of your overall judging should be how the piece is cut. Does it make sense? Is it funny or dramatic? Is the story memorable? And the other 75% is the performance itself. How is their inflection or tone? Did they convey the necessary emotion, enunciation? Did they speak clearly? How is their body language? Was their hand gestures emotional and intentional? Were they varied and were they natural? And most importantly, with dramatic and humorous interpretation is that they are very focused on character. So make sure that if they have just one character, does that character seem very believable? And if they have more than one character, are you able to distinguish between each of them? Remember, you want to give constructive feedback. So say they did very well in character, but they needed to work on their enunciation, write both of those things. You want to make sure you have a mixture of positive and constructive feedback on their speeches so that you're giving the best, giving your speakers the best feedback that you can. Now let's move on to duo interpretation. Duo interpretation is a dramatic and humorous interpretation, but with two people. Just like dramatic and humorous interpretation, these are cut or edited pieces of media like books, movies, plays, short stories, or etc. into 8 to 10 minute speeches. The difference between what's interesting about duo interpretation is that the speakers cannot look at each other or touch one another. Just like dramatic and humorous interpretation, when you're judging, you're making sure that they are within the time constraint, 8 to 10 minute speeches. 25% is how their piece was cut. Does it make sense? Is it funny or dramatic? Is the story memorable? And 75% is the performance. How was each individual performer's inflection or tone? Did they convey the necessary emotion, enunciation? Did they speak clearly? How is their body language or hand gestures? Were they very natural and fluid? And were their characters distinguishable and were they believable? A lot of times in duo interpretation, you'll see that both performers will be taking on more than one character. So you want to make sure that they're distinguishable and that they are believable.
Next, we're going to be talking about program oral interpretation, also known as POI, and this is probably the most advanced speech to write, and that is because it's a speech revolving around one message or theme, but the speaker has to weave multiple texts, so articles, plays, novels, poetry, journals, together to make a multifaceted piece. When you're judging it, make sure that it's a 10-minute speech. It should be above 8 minutes, but most of them should hit 10. The message should be very clear, and not every character needs to have its own backstory and gestures, but you should be able to distinguish between texts. So the play and the piece of poetry shouldn't sound the same or shouldn't look the same. It should be moving, but it shouldn't overly rely on emotions, and the pieces that the student picked should have range and variety. Notice their switches in character, the climax and the power of their speech, how well they incorporated the use of the mini binder into their blocking. This is the difference between dramatic interpretation, humorous interpretation, and POI, is that in a POI, there are multiple sources and they have one prompt, which is a binder that has a script in it. So they should be using that in their blocking and in their movement. Switching gears from interps to original speeches, the first type is original oratory and original advocacy, so OO and OA respectively. This is an event for speakers to advocate or explain a real-world issue that they are passionate about. The difference is that in OO, the issue has to be a social issue, but it does not necessarily need to include a solution. In OA, the issue must have a legislative solution that the speaker explains in their speech. For this reason, OA is usually more concrete, whereas OO can be more abstract. The student wrote their whole speech, so they usually include statistics, jokes, and other persuasive methods. When you're judging, it should be a 10-minute speech. There's no minimum, but it should be above 8 so that the student is fully explaining all of their statistics and their subpoints. These speeches should persuade and entertain you. It shouldn't be overly anecdotal, but it should explain the issue in a way that is understandable and relatable. When you're choosing ranks, think about how motivated you are about the issue after watching the speech. Think about the speaker's body language, their inflection, and whether you are engaged throughout.
And now we're going to get into original prose and poetry. Just like original oratory and original advocacy, this is an 8 to 10 minute original piece, either a narrative or a piece of poetry that the student wrote to be performed. These can be dramatic, humorous, or both. The only limit to the speech is the student's imagination, which makes it a little bit more difficult to judge. I think out of all of the speeches, this is possibly the most difficult to judge because there is so much variety in terms of the different types of speeches that can come out of this event. So for the judging, 50% should be the piece itself. Was it structured well? Did it make sense? Was the story memorable? Mention what aspects of the story you liked and the certain bits that were confusing to you as an audience member. This can help them clarify for the next tournament. Because they did write the piece, they are able to change it between tournaments, and so commenting on these certain aspects of their written piece will definitely help them improve their pieces for the future. And the other 50% is their performance. How is their inflection or tone? Did they convey the necessary emotion, enunciation? Did they speak clearly? Body language, hand gestures, were they very natural and fluid? And in terms of the characters, were they distinguishable or were they believable? So if you're thinking of original prose and poetry like a monologue that you would give in theater, you're basically judging them the same way that you would judge any other performative speech. The only difference between this speech and dramatic and humorous interpretation is that the student wrote it themselves, and so you'll be taking the script into greater consideration.
Next, the last original speech we're going to be talking about is expository, also known as expos. So the bottom line of expository is that it should, above all, explain a topic in an engaging way. You can think of it a bit like a lecture. It usually includes visual aids and a student who's very passionate about their subject. As for judging, it should be an 8 to 10 minute speech, as with other speeches, and 40% should be on how their piece is written. Because this is an original, are their jokes good? Is the information clear? Then you can look at their infographic. They will have a visual aid, and so you can think of their pictures, their transitions, all of that jazz. 45% of your judging should be on their performance. So how was their inflection or tone? How was their body language, their hand gestures? Were they very natural and fluid, or were they kind of stiff and predictable?
So the first are the minute prep. Hang on.